Yeah. He's ready to have a whole meal here.
It was great.
It's totally gourmet.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The highest class of food that you can get is what's in that bucket.
It's true, John. We have all these people here. And people, oh, I want to be so. People, and another thing that starts with P. People, well, they pee and we won't say the other word, okay? What are you going to do with the doo-doo?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detlef. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, and I'm your audio evangelist for the week.
I'm Matt Bernico. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois. And I'm the proprietor of a vegetable stand, and I will sell you talking vegetables.
Well, that's about as believable as the clip that we just heard, which is from the Jim Bakker show. If you're not familiar with Jim Bakker, you're about to be. Over the last couple of weeks, we have been doing a bunch of stuff on evangelicalism, talking about what it is, where it came from, what it does, all that kind of thing. This week, though, we're going to take a closer look at some specific evangelicals, or at least some specific wild Christians, whatever you want to call them, Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker. If you don't know who they are, they were really popular in the 70s and 80s, and then they fell out of the spotlight in a big scandal. Tammy Faye died in 2007, but Jim is back on TV selling huge buckets of the worst food that you could ever see to get you through the coming apocalypse. During the Trump presidency, Jim Bakker has turned into a surreal kind of doomsday preacher, threatening civil war and eating macaroni out of a shovel on his TV show.
Yeah, it's probably worth saying that clip has been edited by the internet artist Vic Berger, so it's not actually quite that surreal. I don't know. It probably is pretty surreal. The only thing he did was changed music.
It's actually probably more surreal to watch it without the editing because it's just a long, boring strain of somebody trying to sell you gigantic vats of industrial grade like cottage cheese and stuff.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Well, to get into the Bakkers more, we talked to Martyn Wendell Jones, a journalist and writer in Toronto, about his article, Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker, A Scandal of the Self. We'll post a link to it in the show notes because you got to read it. It's required reading. You'll get no points in this Magnificast if you don't do the required reading. It's super good, though. You definitely should do it. You can also find lots more Martyn content at martynwendelljones.contently.com. All right, let's go to Martyn.
This week on the Magnificast, we have a really special guest, Martyn Wendell Jones. If you don't know Martyn, he has a number of really great things out there that you can read. This doesn't sound that impressive, but in fact it is. Martyn has like a hodgepodge of just really fun articles kind of floating around the internet. I guess maybe the best way to put it is every time I hear that there's a new article by Martyn that's out there, I get pretty excited and I feel like I need to kind of move some things around in my schedule to make some reading time. Most recently, I've been reading Martyn's newsletter, which is also very fun. A lot of stuff having to do with parenting and seeing your kid grow up. Maybe I'll let you say more about that in a minute here, Wendell. But before we dive in, would you like to introduce yourself and just kind of say a little bit about who you are and what you're into?
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for having me on. My name is Martyn Wendell Jones, and I'm a writer and journalist. I live up here in Toronto. I'm an American and Dutch citizen, an expat living up here in the north. And I'm really interested in literary journalism about religion. That's kind of the area where I've been trying to do a lot of freelance work over the last few years for a variety of publications. I have a newsletter about being a new dad. Fox Jonathan Jones is 8 months old and 1 day.
Cool.
Today, so,
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, we love him. He's quite a precocious kid, physically speaking. He's like pretty big and physically capable, which is a little bit frightening for me, thinking that we might be raising an athlete, seeing as that's just completely outside of my own experience of life. So, but yeah.
That's also my dad experience. My son is extremely physically adept and could probably beat me up if he tried. So it only gets worse.
Yeah. So I've heard.
Those rowdy boys. Well, whenever we have a guest on the show, we always ask them to give kind of like an elevator pitch for what we're going to talk about this week. And out of all the very many things that you have written, Martyn, one that I really love coming back to every once in a while is an essay that you wrote about Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker, some really wild Christian folks. If you don't know who they are, I guess you'll learn more in the next hour or so. But Martyn, you wrote this essay called Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker, A Scandal of the Self for the Washington Examiner. For folks who've never read it or maybe have no idea even who the Bakkers are, could you just give us like a really brief kind of summary of why you wanted to write about these two characters and maybe just generally some of the highlights for you in putting it together?
Yeah. Real quick, I'll just mention that the piece was originally for the Weekly Standard, but I think it's been reprinted in the Examiner. I don't know if that's a big deal, but it's seeing as it's now a defunct publication. But anyway, something to edit out later.
Sure.
Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker are fascinating religious characters who just absolutely dominated the American sort of spiritual and religious imagination in the 1970s and 80s. And then they completely flamed out and have basically receded from public consciousness. Tammy Faye became an icon in the drag community. She's beloved of people such as RuPaul. And Jim Bakker is returned after going to jail for fraud, among other things, and is now trying to rebuild the utopian community that he had originally started as the latter part of his ministry. And as part of that, he is selling freeze-dried survival food and is fixated on the apocalypse and is a big Trump guy. So Jim and Tammy Faye really represent, I think, the sort of intersecting currents of a number of really important themes in American religious history and are a really fascinating sort of window into the American character more generally.
Yeah, that's so cool. It's so weird how I don't know anything about Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker. I guess I'm young enough so that it was never sort of a moment for me. I only know him as that weird guy on YouTube that I see selling, freeze-dried macaroni and rice and acting like a big weirdo. So it's interesting to learn more about him and just kind of know about the cultural history that's going on there. Yeah, I guess maybe could you say a little bit about why this story is important? Like, why worry about Jim Bakker at all? Like, what's sort of the hook here that got you interested?
Yeah, I see in Jim Bakker actually a really important sort of prefiguring of a lot of the stuff we actually are seeing with the current American president. I think that his relationship to the media, his understanding of himself, these are all things I think are reflected pretty clearly in Trump. And I think that the sort of spiritual side of the current president in this way is something that's sort of underexplored, I suppose. But more generally, I see the Bakkers as being a perfect representation of some really big themes in American religious history, as I said before, but specifically this sort of continuing legacy of religious enthusiasm, which is a sort of post-Protestant European spiritual phenomenon that sort of decentered doctrine and theology in favor of deeply personal religious experience. And that's a trend that we see continued in an American context in really interesting ways through originally revivalist itinerant preachers and Wesleyanism and then Pentecostalism, which gave rise to the Bakkers. So forms of just ecstatic religious faith, focusing on signs and wonders, miraculous healings. The Bakkers are sort of in that lineage, which is part of a kind of, it's almost part of a shadow history, I guess, of American culture, explored by folks like Gilbert Seldes in a book called The Stammering Century, which is one of my very favorites. So he continues kind of this almost like shadow tradition in American culture that I think is hugely influential with huge sections of the population. I mean, thinking again of Trump, Trump has a huge basis of support among Pentecostals and charismatics, which is a story that I haven't really seen made much of. But I mean, folks who prophesied about him and saw him as being actually, God's trumpet, they said, you can look at places like Charisma Magazine or Bill Johnson at Bethel Church, sort of a abiding interest of mine. These are all places that have really gotten on board with the Trump phenomenon. And I think it's because Trump has a sort of intuitive, maybe like rhetorical sense for some of the same themes that Bakker had in his own ministry, which endeared Bakker originally to so many people, millions of people ultimately around the world, and also Trump to his hardcore base of supporters.
Oh, thanks. That's a really great way to introduce the conversation because we definitely want to come around to the Trump stuff. I mean, we've been trying on the show the last few episodes to contextualize evangelicalism and the contemporary moment, and this is such a unique angle on it. So we'll ask you a lot more about Trump probably in a minute. But I guess just to make sure everybody's kind of along for the ride, one of the most interesting things about your essay is, like what Matt was saying earlier, you do this great job contextualizing Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker far beyond just like the, Jim Bakker's return to TV and that sort of a thing. So could you lay out maybe just in broad strokes, like the highs and lows of the Bakker saga? What's kind of the brief timeline of what we're looking at in terms of their moment in American history?
Yeah. So Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker, they were born in Pentecostal contexts in the northern U.S., and they met when they were attending an Assemblies of God Bible school in the early 60s, and then they dropped out after they got married. And around this time in the early 60s, they met this guy who's like, hey, listen, Jim and Tammy Faye, I'm going to buy a yacht that used to be owned by Errol Flynn, and I'm going to go up and down the Amazon River preaching to the natives, and you should join me. So they committed a lot of money to this venture, and then obviously they got swindled. The guy disappeared. And so at that point, they became itinerant healing evangelists, and they basically did a circuit around the South, going to different churches and preaching and, sort of trying to bring on the gifts of the Spirit, which charismatics believe, when you're baptized in the Holy Spirit, sort of recalling Pentecost, there are special spiritual gifts such as speaking in tongues and miraculous healings that, sort of doled out among believers. But so they were discovered in 1965, so mid-60s, by Pat Robertson, and they ended up getting into television at this point. Tammy Faye, born performer, a natural performer, always wanted to be on television, and Jim Bakker was quite a performer as well. They ended up helping to found the Christian Broadcasting Network, ended up breaking with Pat Robertson, and then met the Paul and Jan Crouch, the Crouches, and then helped move to California in the early 70s and helped them to found the Trinity Broadcasting Network. So they hand in founding two hugely important and influential Christian television broadcasting networks. And then they went to Charlotte, North Carolina after breaking then with the Crouches. And they hosted a telethon and ended up having like this experience of just like incredible revival. Apparently there was lots of speaking in tongues and, like a sort of quite an experience. And they ended up deciding to stay there in Charlotte. And that's where they ended up setting up shop. So by the mid 70s, they have relocated to Charlotte, North Carolina. They have bought an old furniture store and set up a makeshift studio to start their own thing. And this is when PTL begins. So the best single source for information on the Bakkers and what I've derived a lot of narrative from is historian John Wigger's book, PTL, The Rise and Fall of Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker's Evangelical Empire. So it's really, the book is focused on their television ministry, which is what they're primarily known for. But there's also quite a lot about Jim and Tammy Faye's biography in this. So throughout the rest of the 70s, they continue building the television network. They end up investing in their own satellite uplink, which gives them the ability to broadcast all over the world to audiences in dozens of countries. They end up reaching an audience of millions. And at this point, they start getting into sort of like sketchy sort of financial appeals, especially as Jim Bakker develops kind of, in solid American tradition, a kind of utopian vision for what they could build here in North Carolina. So at this point, they end up building out a Christian theme park called Heritage USA, which really end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. Heritage USA is a theme park that they found that ends up turning into a resort. Jim Bakker hopes at some point that will grow to house 30,000 permanent residents. And this thing really grew in 1986, I believe it is. Wigger reports that Heritage USA was the third most visited theme park in America after, I think, Disneyland and Disney World. So it became absolutely massive. It was a vacation destination for the sorts of people who watch Jim and Tammy Faye's show. People could buy timeshares in, this like beautiful hotel that they had built on the grounds. One of the things he got in trouble for was overselling the timeshare. So people were, basically promised like a certain number of nights they could stay at Heritage USA every year. And they would call ahead to try and book time, and they would basically find no availability for like 3 years because there were so many people who had bought these. And that's one of the things that led to an investigation by the FCC and a number of other investigations that led to the downfall of the Bakkers in the late 80s. Jim Bakker went to prison for fraud. Tammy Faye divorced him, ended up marrying a contractor who went to prison himself for bankruptcy fraud. It's just like an absolute mess. Everyone who's involved in Heritage USA and the television ministry, things just kind of fell apart. And also during this time, Jerry Falwell and Jimmy Swaggart sort of move in, knives out, to try and acquire and scavenge PTL for their own purposes. In light of the accusations against Jim Bakker, and that part of that was also a sex scandal. So it was the late 80s when all of this sort of fell apart, and when the Bakkers kind of disappeared for a while.
There's so many interesting things to say about that story, and I'd love to get into. Man, I want to know so much what a Christian theme park would look like. I guess it's my big wonder, and I can figure that out by myself, I guess. But TV is a huge part of Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker's story. Being, I don't know, maybe I guess you'd call them televangelists, but maybe there's a better word for what they are particularly. But yeah, I don't know. How does TV fit into their idea of Christianity? I guess what was the impetus for being on television for them?
Yeah, there's a great documentary called The Eyes of Tammy Faye, which was made in the 2000s. And in that documentary, she talks about her relationship to the camera and what it meant to her. And she said it's not really a camera, it's actually people. It's people to connect with. Tammy Faye was, just this amazing font of sincerity, just absolutely guileless. She just wanted to be on TV. There's a book by Nancy Eisenberg called White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America. And in this book, she talks about Tammy Faye as someone who claimed to derive her signature style from Lucille Ball and Minnie Mouse. And Roger Ebert is also quoted in this book as judging Tammy Faye to have spent more of her life on television than any other living person. So this is really something that was actually deeply important to her. And when it comes to their ministry, there's actually the way that they approach their show in the early days, the PTL Club, is perfectly resonant actually with the sort of early 19th century camp meeting revival preaching that really launched sort of the Methodist sort of revivalism in the United States. So preachers back then, typically from a variety of denominations, would read sermons just from manuscripts that they had prepared. And the Methodist itinerant preachers were really remarkable for abandoning the notes and preaching extemporaneously. Charles Wesley is described as an experimentalist in the Seldy's book I mentioned earlier, The Stammering Century. Charles Wesley, whom I mentioned earlier, was described in a book by Monsignor Ronald Knox called Enthusiasm as someone who's a great spiritual experimentalist who, while he was preaching, would sort of gauge the reaction in his audience to the things he was saying, and he would adjust his approach based on the feedback that he was getting. And this is kind of, this lineage of, sort of extemporaneous improvisational showmanship is something that leads right up to Jim Bakker and Tammy Faye Bakker deciding to never have scripts and to ad-lib their entire show in the early days, and to sort of take a kind of anarchic approach to how they would actually do the TV show. There was one episode that was filmed entirely on a merry-go-round. There was a guy in a dog costume who vomited in his suit, because of this choice. So they, they're in this new medium. It's in the, sort of early days of satellite distribution. So almost anything is possible. And they're really innovators when it comes to that technology and that method of distribution. And they really are just trying all sorts of things, all of it for the purpose in the early days of, I think, a sincere spiritual intention. They wanted to create a sort of, a source of religious programming that would provide a real alternative to the secular media that they both were aware of and enjoyed. The PTL Club was originally modeled on, late shows like Johnny Carson. It was really, a place where they would just have celebrities in, and they had quite a large number of celebrities from all different walks of life come in and speak on the show. And some of them they earned some, they got some blowback for it. Like Larry Flint, the publisher of Hustler, was on the show at one point. And I think he even took Jim Bakker on his plane. Like they would have anyone who was sort of had achieved celebrity status on the show to talk.
Yeah, there's so much going on there. Like Matt keeps saying, there's so many pieces to just keep pulling apart. Maybe we'll circle back to them in a moment. But I feel like in the interest of getting to some of the weirdest ones, I want to pivot to kind of some of the recent years that Jim Bakker has been reinventing himself, as you mentioned earlier, as this person rebranding almost along with the Trump presidency as this doomsday apocalypticist, selling these big vats of like horrible food to his audience. It's pretty unsettling. I mean, Matt and I were just watching some admittedly edited, specifically edited videos of Jim Bakker, but nevertheless, I feel like you probably don't have to edit that hard to draw out what's kind of disturbing about it. So anyway, maybe we could start at the end of your essay and sort of work backwards. So you have this amazing paragraph where you close it out, where you write, "What Bakker, prophet of that religion, now promises is a survivable cataclysm. Bunkering down with the Lord, we will emerge to find ourselves free again of the society that restricts our freedom. Prepare, Bakker says. Listen to me, send checks. The apocalypse is coming and most of humankind will be destroyed. But you can make it. Try the macaroni and remember, God loves you. He really does." I love everything about that paragraph. It's so masterfully done. I guess though, I don't know what to ask about it except to say, like, what the hell is going on here? Like, what is this phenomenon, and how does this maybe continue or depart from the Bakker phenomenon you were just talking about? This kind of PTL Club, Minnie Mouse style approach.
Yes, So with this paragraph in particular, was trying to capture, I guess, some of the sensibility that I still see in Jim Bakker, and that I think has been consistent for several decades with him at this point. A book that I really like on this subject is called The American Religion by Harold Bloom, which I refer to elsewhere in the piece. Harold Bloom, basically, his thesis is essentially that the American sort of spiritual genius and the American religious imagination is defined not by anything like a doctrinally robust Christianity, but something far closer to a sort of Gnosticism or a Gnostic paradigm. And by that, he means not only, sort of a secret knowledge that's transmitted, by a sort of group of elect, but also, essentially a metaphysical intuition. There's a way in which Americans have a sense of themselves as, there being a pure self, like a kind of, like the real me that exists, and that, essentially is co-equal with God in a sense, uncreated, this uncreated spark. And the self in this paradigm cannot actually be sullied by its sort of engagements in the material world. So notions like sin, the things that you actually go up and do, like, when Bakker is accused of fraud, or like the sex scandal, all these accusations, he's basically able to dissociate his real self from those actions in the world and kind of, like brush them off. It's the kind of classic public apology that's actually a non-apology of, that really wasn't me. That's not the real me. I wasn't myself is something that's slightly different, but kind of in the same vein. So I see this spiritual paradigm, which, sort of takes over a kind of like more traditionally Christian vocabulary and set of concepts as being the thing that's kind of the, at the center of the Bakker phenomenon, and also to some degree with the Trump phenomenon. But for Bakker, there's a shocking passage actually in one of his books. It's his memoir that he released after he got out of prison, which is called I Was Wrong. And in the memoir, he talks about the sex scandal, which, since I haven't mentioned it yet, I'll just briefly recap. There was a woman who was a big fan of his ministry. A meeting was arranged between her and Bakker, and in that meeting, he ended up forcing himself upon her, and then ended up, in light of that, someone who was sort of opposed to him and his ministry, use that for leverage against him. And this was related to, but basically there was money provided for a cover-up by the contractor, coincidentally, that Tammy Faye ended up marrying. And that cover-up money, I think something to the tune of maybe $260,000 or $265,000. The existence of that money was disclosed to the press, and reporting by Charles Shepard and others ended up earning the Pulitzer Prize and helping to bring down Baker's ministry. But so in his memoir, he talks about the Han encounter and about how, it was wrong, and he met with this Christian counselor who said, to him, yeah, I can tell you just need forgiveness. You need forgiveness for yourself. You need forgiveness from God. You need forgiveness from Jessica. You have to sort this out, and then you'll be free. And so 2 days after Jim Bakker has raped this poor woman, he basically absolves himself. And then this same person tells him not to tell his wife, Tammy Faye, and he doesn't tell her for 6 years. And this is kind of the, like something that I think is related to like his later sensibility. There's a way in which like these things that he gets up to, like the fraud, deceiving his followers, all this stuff, he's able to just like brush off, say that wasn't really him. And he also at one point in his memoir talks about how, figuring out who he really was, like his true self, was an important task that he had to undertake when he was in prison. And of course, as he like sort of has this prolonged engagement with himself and also with scripture, he ends up converting this sort of apocalypticism, and he just finds his next grift, essentially. But this, I see, like these elements as kind of linked. There's also a sense of, it's again on the level of a kind of spiritual or metaphysical intuition, a sort of sense of himself, and also that a sense that his followers have that, they are in a sense elect, even if they are not by any means doctrine or Calvinist. They still have a sense of God's special blessing, which connects us back to other themes in American history, the sense of manifest destiny, and still the kind of chauvinism that characterizes the United States position vis-a-vis the rest of the world in so many ways. But I see all of this is expressed in a sort of unique constellation in the person of Jim Bakker to this day.
Yeah. I want to kind of dig into that true self of Jim Bakker a bit more. But maybe first with his relationship to Donald Trump, sort of post prison. Man, I think everything I see about Jim Bakker that is so surprising and weird to me is usually when he's talking about Donald Trump and kind of expressing his extremely theologized version of Trump as president and sort of like other kind of end times figure. So there's like this video of Jim Bakker on the election night in 2016. And Jim Bakker, he's hosting a show. He's doing his usual thing. He's selling big buckets of macaroni to people. But he's like anticipating Trump's victory. And he said things like, if Donald Trump wins, it shows that he's really God's candidate, because like, how else could he possibly win? And then there's another instance in 2017 when Jim Bakker said that, if Donald Trump is impeached by the Democrats, that it would start a civil war. Christians would start a civil war specifically. So kind of riffing off these ideas of, his true self and his apocalypticism, like what is going on with Jim Bakker and his like his fascination with Donald Trump?
That's a great question. And I mean, here I'm on, really would just have to speculate. I do think that there's a kind of consonance between their characters in many ways. Jim Bakker, is a consummate showman, capacity developed over decades on television. I mean, he and Tammy Faye, like their children really did grow up on television. Like they spent so much time with the PTL Club in front of cameras. The children are still dealing with that legacy. It was something obviously unchosen for them. And I think that this sort of, theme park that he created, this, like escapist utopian fantasy, sort of fed into that as well. This, there's a way in which Trump, I think, has access to the same sort of idiom, I suppose. I see Trump's, I see Trump as being able to make a rhetorical appeal to Americans who share this sort of, not the sensibility, but the same kind of intuition about themselves that Bakker does, and who maybe have not brought that to a level of, like explicit elaboration. But there's a way in which Trump is able to look at people who, they feel unjustly maligned. They're really uncomfortable by a lot of the cultural conversations and the reckonings that are happening, having to do with sexual violence and abuse, having to do with race and, violence against racialized communities. These people, Trump speaks to, just like seas of white faces and their red hats, and he points at them and he basically intimates, I know who you are. I know that you're good people, and I know that they have you figured wrong, and I am your man. Like there's a kind of, I think, like sort of immediate connection he's able to make with his audiences that I think draws water through the same roots that Bakker's appeal did, and Bakker as well. When he was first being investigated by like the FCC, he mounted a full sort of like counter investigation campaign, and it even had its own theme song. It was a song called "Enough Is Enough." And that sort of indignation, and that sense of, being at war with these outer forces, who are sort of gunning for him and persecuting him, that sense of, like persecution, being singled out, was something that he made a lot of money on. It was extremely rhetorically effective. And obviously we see the same kinds of things in Trump, but I think both of them have that sense of being fundamentally misunderstood, and also, people who are really just, in a way, kind of sure of themselves. There are certain questions I don't think either of them has ever been forced to ask about his own presence and way in the world. And that's, at this point, we're talking about two people who, just in terms of their private lives, I imagine, have, left kind of, a trail of injuries and casualties among the people they've known.
Yeah, I'm going to have to remember that Enough is Enough campaign for when someone finally takes down the corruption scandal with the Magnificast. That'll be how I ward it off. Well, you're doing this work not only on the Bakkers, but on, as you said earlier, kind of religious journalism related to the United States. And I always hesitate to put people in the speculation seat, but I'm going to do it anyway. You're drawing these parallels between Trump and Jim Bakker that I think are really helpful. And I wonder what you think of the discourse around Donald Trump and the evangelical support for him. Because a lot of people, especially after he was elected, it seemed almost as if there was article after article being published about how either it is not surprising at all that evangelicals support Donald Trump, or kind of hand-wringing about the hypocrisy or alleged hypocrisy of evangelicals supporting Donald Trump. And having kind of discovered these echoes of resonances between the character of Trump and Bakker, I wonder what you react to that kind of media story. I mean, is there any kind of light that you think this investigation that you've done shows on that story?
That's a difficult question. And we're definitely operating at this point above my pay grade, but I'll venture a few things. I find John Fee's book, Believe Me, about evangelical support for Trump helpful in this way. I think that a lot of the evangelical affinity for Trump has been kind of fear-based. I think, from, just the people filling the pews in your average Midwestern church to, university presidents, like there's a kind of anxiety about the institutions that they love being, under threat from liberal politicians when it comes to like tax exempt status and a number of other sort of related issues. And I think that fear is certainly a motivating force for some of the people who voted for him. But there is something else that's happening too. And I think that this, the story of the Bakkers, I think does sort of prepare the way for, the story of Trump's positive appeal. So not just the fear-based appeal, but the positive appeal. And I think that there is a way in which he is able to sort of immediately connect with people on that level who would identify as evangelicals. I think that there are distinctions that could be meaningfully drawn. I think that, I still attend a Presbyterian church that's on the more conservative side theologically. And I think that there's a difference between, sort of folks who sort of fit the profile of like my pastors there, for instance, versus, what Alan Jacobs in a recent Atlantic piece called God and Country Believers. But I think that there's not really a lot of room for, sort of comfortable distancing here. I think that there is kind of also an evangelical intellectual commentariat that kind of floats over and is sort of has an epiphenomenal relationship with, obviously a base that's been energized and that is really going a different direction from a lot of folks like Jacobs, and people were trying to carve out more of a place for a kind of political centrism for evangelicals. But ultimately, I do think that there is something that evangelicals responded to in Trump's appeal that goes beyond the content of what he said, since it's never really about the content per se, on the level of the text, but really about more a message that he communicates, sort of in subtextually, I suppose. I I mean, I find it a little bit heartbreaking, the statistic that 81% of evangelicals who voted. Um, and there's a lot of rot in the American sort of evangelical space that's been brought to light. I think ultimately that will be a good thing, but it's also, it's difficult to watch. I don't enjoy that.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked a lot about Jim Bakker specifically, but maybe we can turn an eye to Tammy Faye for a second. Well, and Jim too, but Tammy Faye is an interesting character in herself and worth our attention. Um, you write that Tammy Faye was one of the first Christians to embrace the gay community during the AIDS crisis. In your article, you write the drag queen RuPaul, who narrates the documentary you mentioned earlier, was a longtime friend of Tammy Faye's and described her in an interview as an ascended master, someone who's understood the complexities of life and made a conscious decision to focus on the light, which is really a sweet description. Tammy Faye she ended up dying of cancer in 2007, and to this day, she's regarded as an icon of camp. That was sort of the end of your quote there. So if that's how Tammy's true self is remembered, which is pretty good actually, what do you think about the opposite direction of Jim becoming sort of a Trump supporter, threatening civil war, preparing for a literal apocalypse, and so on? Like, how do we make sense of them as a couple, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like the fact that they were divorced when Jim went to prison that's really important. I think that there was a real split in their relationship, and it had to do with his sort of utopian dream. I mean, this is sort of I guess it's kind of a microcosm for a lot of the like sort of political trends that it's related to more recently. But like Jim Bakker really did want to create a sort of this, not just a vacation destination, but really a living community of people who are able to just exist in kind of an artificial world of religious fantasy. They wanted, and again, they're also like taking the symbols of the sort of the American religious past and using them and sort of like reaffirming like this is sort of at the heart of American identity. So they were creating this giant, they built this giant barn where they would have, Camp Meeting USA was one of the programs that they would film there, that visitors to this theme park would, they would all fill out like the seats and they would have these big revival style meetings in this giant barn. And Bakker had planned this old Jerusalem village, he called it. It was supposed to be built out with period detail. There are a couple places online, if you search for photos of Heritage USA, you can find some pretty interesting photo sets of these, of like the theme park that had been built as it's like sort of become derelict and then sort of, like entered a period of decay with like vines growing up over it. And the sort of, the folks who've come in and then tried to like, take bits and pieces of it and sort of revitalize them. There's some really interesting like photo essays about the sort of like the dereliction of Heritage USA, which I find kind of amusing. But anyway, it was really over this like Jim's desire to create this to create and build out this community where the TV network only played a small part. And Tammy Faye's whole like her reason for life was to be on TV and to just keep those programs going, and to really, she wanted to connect with people. And the documentary, which is really worth seeing, narrated by RuPaul, The Eyes of Tammy Faye, she does try to get back on television and makes a number of unsuccessful pitches, but they're all so earnest and they're all so sweet. Like one of them is she pitches a show called Tammy's Terrific Teens. And the purpose of the show is just for her to hang out with teenagers and to, like talk about their choices. And just, she says in her pitch for this show, like, I just, like I want teens to know that, like they're adults who care for them. And I just want them to feel affirmed. I know this, it's just something that teenagers don't get a lot of. So there's just this, this spirit that she has, I guess, that I find really compelling. And, I think that she's a really interesting figure. And people were also really cruel to her. I mean, she's a very interesting sort of, like her public persona. I don't know that there was a huge difference between it and sort of the way in which she experienced her own life. I'm not sure how to draw the distinctions very finely in this area, but there's a way in which she was, she was just classically irrepressible. And what's really interesting to me about her is, the like fake eyelashes and other things. She talks about this in the documentary. She describes it as being really her, like that's just me. That's really me. Like her makeup, which she became sort of infamous for, especially in the 80s. It was just kind of a symbol of this sort of vulgar venality of the Bakkers as they were, like taking more and more money away from the ministry and buying homes in places like Miami and all of this stuff that they used to develop just this lavish lifestyle, surrounding themselves with fixers. Like she, I think, was treated very cruelly in some cases by the press. In that documentary, there are T-shirts that have the inscription, "I ran into Tammy Faye at the mall," and it's just like sort of the imprint of a clown face of her makeup, just like smeared, like mascara and like dripping, like blush and different colors and stuff. But there was, all of that is kind of, it makes sense that that's the way in which she was treated, I suppose, especially during that time. But there's something really different, I think, that was happening for her. And she and Jim, I think, really starting in the 80s, really went in very different directions. And this also has to do with Jim Bakker's sexual identity and his sort of coming to terms with, his apparent bisexuality, according to, like Wigger's book. And Bakker even speculates about this side of himself in his memoir, I Was Wrong. Since he was, when he was a young man, was abused by an older member of his church. And he sort of like links that experience to his later sort of recreational interest and intimate relations with other men. But
that's really interesting that you would take the time to kind of like go through and really sift out, what a true, like the true character of these kind of larger than life people. This is a probably impossible to answer question, but I thought it'd be interesting to hear what you'd say just the same. Jim Bakker's reputation is sort of forever scarred by being a swindler, right? By being guilty of taking money and all these other, sexual violence and everything else. But it's kind of interesting, though, that he did want to sort of start a utopian type of Christian community. That's like a really interesting part of the story. And okay, again, I'm still fixated on the theme park part of it. I can't get around that in my head. But do you think that Jim Bakker's like desire for Heritage USA was like in any way legitimately like driven by his Christianity? Do you think it was just like another sort of like gimmick that he was going to use to get more money? Do you think that's something that you can even distinguish between? I don't know. Do you think that Jim Bakker was like legitimately interested in the ministry, or was he just kind of like a sleazy guy?
That's a great question.
Or both.
Yeah, I think as with so many things, I think that it's just a sort of you can't put this in the centrifuge and sort of separate out the elements. I think that there was sort of an earnest desire to build like a community that I think was rooted in this sort of like his religious faith. I think there also was obviously like a series of opportunities for making quite a lot of money and withdrawing a lot of money on the basis of that venture. And it's really with the building of the theme park that they get into really serious financial trouble. Like Bakker had always been sort of erratic in how he would plan his projects. People who were on staff at PTL would keep monitors in their workrooms and watch the show as it was being taped live so that they could know what their next project was. Like he would announce things on the air without consulting anyone. And that continued after, he spent all this money on developing this gigantic property into this community. And this really, it's hard for me to sort of, solidly characterize, like his motivations, I suppose, but it does connect him again to, an earlier period in American history. And again, I'll refer to Gilbert Seldy's book, The Stammering Century, which covers the 19th century. It's kind of provides a shadow history of American life in that period. And, he focuses on the strivers and the quacks and the theologasters and the, other people like who also had these sort of utopian visions. As the American frontier was expanding westward by means of violence and disease and much else, in the space that would be cleared out by these incursions, people in the early 19th century saw opportunities for creating for founding and creating communities such as New Harmony in Indiana or the Oneida community, where groups of people who were like-minded religiously would come into, like these small communal arrangements, support themselves economically, and live out, what they saw as being the way of heaven. And I think that Bakker had a little bit of that, but sort of, he wasn't a great visionary or thinker. There really was just a sort of sense of, culture is sort of being degraded. We're moving in these secular directions. We need to recover the sort of Christian heart of the United States. And that's, Heritage USA is a place where Christian families can come and find sort of like be among their own people and find their own culture represented. And that's really tricky to, even if there were sincere motivations underwriting that, obviously there are very complicated ideas sort of at play in that, and problematic ideas of various sorts. But I do think that, there was a mix of sincerity and guile in his original plan for the park. And he was just such a dominant personality that there were really few people who were capable of standing in his way when he started down that path.
I'm really curious to hear you maybe tie that into the turn that Jim Bakker has now, because it seems, maybe I'm misunderstanding it in a bit, but it seems to me that the Heritage theme park, in many respects, is this utopic vision, like you're just saying. It carries on this strange American tradition of building these tiny utopias, even if it's, in an extremely commercialized way or something like that. But it seems now there's certainly some of that in Jim Bakker's approach on television these days, right? It's gathering together all these like-minded people and nervous about secularism, etc. But it's almost like the refusal of utopia and the affirmation of dystopia. It's sort of accepted the loss, and it's trying to carve out some kind of weird remnant. Like it is literally an apocalyptic vision, more than like a filmic kind of vision. Like you would emerge from the bunker, from Jim Bakker's bunker, having been fed and nourished by these decisions into some kind of future, who knows what. So it's wild, because lots of folks are talking about this moment in U.S. politics as a weird transition time for evangelicalism, and it seems like Jim Bakker is trying to figure that out too. And I wonder what you make of, right now, evangelicalism is really at the height of its cynicism and the height of its power, right? Like it's holding all the cards, and yet at the same time, Jim Bakker is choosing this moment to feel like now's the time to invest in building the bunker. What do you make of that transition?
Yeah, gosh. Yeah, there's really a lot there. I will say that while Bakker is investing while Bakker is hawking these wares, like the survival food and all this like freeze-dried stuff, he also is building out this 700-acre property in Missouri to sort of like, as a kind of almost a reprisal of Heritage USA, where, there are people who I think there are full-time residents there, but he's sort of, as he did with Heritage USA, there was like a main building. And then outside that building, there were like these like little alleyways with like shops and storefronts. And it was meant to be kind of like, I don't know, almost like Stars Hollow from the Gilmore Girls, like this kind of like impossibly sort of perfect little American community, like sheltered. And the interesting thing to me about Morningside, the place where he's filming these segments where he hawks all this food, is that you have the same sort of Main Street feel, but it's all indoors now, at least from the look of it. Like they have, kind of almost like Casa Bonita in Colorado. Sort of like interior space has been, just like decorated out to give you this sense of being like sort of on Main Street, but also underground sort of at the same time. It's when it comes to this sort of apocalyptic turn, I think that there's a way in which Bakker, emerging sort of from the personal spiritual darkness of prison, like I think that really inflected his own imagination in a certain way. And I think that he ended up coming to see, like the persecution he felt he had undergone at the hands of the media and the investigators who brought down his ministry, I think kind of turned him against the mainstream American culture in a certain way. I think that he has regarded the past several decades of cultural change with a lot of anger and suspicion. And I think it makes sense that the way forward for him to sort of refound the utopian vision that he originally had for Heritage is to embrace sort of the cleaning of the slate. The idea is, like this, people would be enabled by him and by his wares to, as he said, to go underground and then reemerge after, like the alarms have gone off and after we've hit the reset button on civilization, and those people would sort of inherit the earth in a way. I think that far more than judgment, there's sort of a maybe kind of sublimated longing for the open frontier. And I think that the only way to achieve that, apart from going to space, is through just unimaginable violence and destruction. And I think that there's a way in which embracing the specter of that is one way, and preparing to sort of survive, even though none of us know what that could mean, is one way of holding on to the hope for a world in which it's possible to live in the kind of freedom that I think Bakker desired for people, coming to Heritage, to come and be among their own people, and to, feel as though they were really at home and away from an outer world that threatened them.
It's really fascinating that you say that, because we had a guy not too long ago, Tad DeLay, who has a new book out called Against, about evangelicalism, where he sort of pathologizes evangelicals as basically longing for destruction or disaster. It's kind of motivated by the production of turmoil, because without that turmoil, your life is sort of without, it doesn't get the same meaning from being saved or receiving grace or something, if it doesn't have that big debt of horror or terror. And yeah, I guess it seems like Jim Bakker is sort of feeding into that in some way. I guess as we come to a close, we're coming up at the bottom of the hour here. Do you see that kind of story as related to politics, or do you feel like Jim Bakker is maybe an oddity who has some resonances or some explanatory power for the current moment, but is still ultimately kind of cartoonishly beyond the pale or on the margins? How exactly are we to evaluate maybe what Jim Bakker tells us about the present moment and evangelicalism's relationship to politics in that way?
Yeah. There are lots and lots of evangelicals who don't believe in the way that Bakker does, is I guess the first thing I would say. I think that Pentecostalism's relationship with evangelicalism is a little bit tricky to map out correctly. There's not a lot of, I think, overlapping readership between, say, like Charisma Magazine and Christianity Today. I do think that they share certain traits and attributes, but I haven't really thought too much about how, I guess, like Bakker in particular is able to hold the mirror up to evangelicals more generally. And he might seem like an oddity to a lot of those folks, even as he articulates things that are certainly, I think, deeply ingrained in their own spiritual lives and imaginations. But I think, more importantly, the thing that Bakker does is he does, I think, open a window onto a larger Pentecostal and charismatic spiritual world, which I think is still very poorly understood in American media, especially, and even by, I guess, sort of more pedestrian Protestants who don't really buy into the idea of, like the gifts of the Holy Spirit, such as speaking in tongues and performing miracles, who, are maybe openly cessationist or just like kind of like made anxious by people who really embrace the sort of ecstatic side of Christian spirituality. Charismatics, as I said before, among charismatics, generally there's a huge amount of support for Trump, and it has to do with his having, essentially become a sort of prophesied for figure in the lead up to the election. And Bakker had on his show, I mentioned the article, Paula White, with her husband, Jonathan Cain, coincidentally keyboardist from Journey, but Paula White and other people, who are similar to her, have very large online followings in many cases, and are plugged into poorly understood networks of Pentecostal and charismatic churches, and they just think in very, very different terms about the current American political situation. And, their enthusiasm really, I think, has animated a lot of the folks who have turned out in support of Trump at the polls. I wouldn't be able to, quantify the meaning of that support, I suppose, but charismatic forms of Christian faith are certainly on the rise worldwide. There are a lot of reasons for that. The types of hope and consolation Pentecostalism and charismatic forms of faith offer, those are real and they're precious to people who are in very, very difficult circumstances materially. And it's a movement that doesn't prioritize doctrinal formulation. It's, classic sort of spiritual enthusiasm in Ronald Knox's sense. The networks are largely informal, but they're, growing more and more powerful. One church that I did some reporting on, Bethel Church in Redding, California, they explicitly take up civic institutions as part of their mandate for evangelism, and also their growing sort of political agency locally. And they've installed people who are sympathetic to their aims at different levels of government locally, and they're also well connected in other areas. And they see sort of capturing the mountain of culture as being an essential part of the mandate for their ministry. And that's the sort of thing that Bakker kind of points to. There's something here that's, like a little bit unnerving, and it's kind of anarchic, and it's incredibly compelling. And there's a lot happening there that I don't think is very well understood. That's very relevant to the current political situation. And I think, people who take Trump to be the realization of prophecy, that ends up requiring a different kind of allegiance and support than, your average citizen would offer to someone who's been democratically elected, is what I'll say about that.
Yeah, that's a really helpful nuance. Well, over the past few weeks, we've been trying to tell the story of evangelicalism and how it works out and how it works its way out in politics. And I think through Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker, you've really given us some helpful nuance and wrinkles to the story that we've been telling. I'm so interested, and I think you get it right when you talk about enthusiasm and the way that it works out sort of non-doctrinally, and how that definitely does lend itself to creating these pretty big political but religiously fueled networks of power. And that is pretty wild. So anyways, thanks a lot for writing this essay and talking to us with it. It's really helpful and cool. So I hope everyone out there goes and reads it.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate you guys having me on. Thank you.
Yeah, I should say, Martyn, also at the end as we sign off here, if people wanted to find more of your material or wanted to read some more of your stuff, how would they do that?
I keep an online portfolio where you can find clips and other work that I've done, anything from journalism, essays, reviews, criticism, etc. And you can find that at martynwendelljones.contently.com. And Martyn is spelled with a Y.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, and you know you did, you loved it, send your checks to us and we'll send you that big box of macaroni. That's code language for please support us on Patreon. If you want to do that, you can go to patreon.com/themagnificast. If you can't do that, that's cool too. Then you should just leave us a nice iTunes review on the old iTunes or wherever you get your podcast from. We'll take your reviews on any platform. We're not picky. Cool. So thanks to Martyn Wendell Jones again. Check out his stuff. He's a great writer and a great analyst and storyteller, I would say. Cool. So thanks also to the Jim Bakker Show for letting us steal some weird content from them for the intro. We didn't ask them, but it's probably okay. And also thanks to Tammy Faye Bakker for this extremely good tune for our outro music. This is Tammy Faye Bakker, Enough is Enough, to take us out. See you next week.
The giant had cursed and blasphemed God, like some still do.